September 2nd, 1945. The world was still reeling from the voice of Emperor Hirohito crackling across the radio waves, conceding a defeat that many in Japan had believed impossible. Cities smoldered, families searched through rubble for remnants of their lives, and hunger was no longer a fear of tomorrow, but a reality of each day. Yet in far-flung corners of the Pacific, on Tinian, Okinawa, and Luzon, a quieter story was unfolding, one that revealed something unexpected about the very nature of war and the human heart. Imagine the scene. A line of weary Japanese women, their cotton uniforms faded, their hair pulled back hastily, their stomachs gnawing with emptiness after years of rationed books and meager meals. They shuffled forward in silence, their minds heavy with dread. U.S. Marines had captured them. Auxiliary nurses, clerks, even relief volunteers who had been swept into the tide of the Pacific War. Their expectation was clear: punishment, humiliation, starvation. For years, propaganda had warned them of what the Americans would do. Mothers whispered dark warnings about cruelty, about dishonor worse than death. Now the moment had come, and the women braced themselves for the cold grip of vengeance. Instead, they were handed trays, metal trays that steamed with food, white rice, grilled fish, vegetables cooked until tender, a slice of bread beside it all. And standing at the line, the Americans did not leer or mock. They served, ladling portions with routine efficiency, their expressions unreadable but not unkind. The smell hit the women first. Warm rice, savory broth, the unmistakable richness of protein. Emiko clutched her tray, as though it might vanish if she blinked. Another whispered, half in disbelief, better than mother's cooking. The words slipped out like a betrayal, and yet carried a strange relief, as though the very act of eating could be the first step toward survival. The irony was almost unbearable. In Tokyo, Yokohama, and the countryside beyond, mothers stood in kitchens stripped bare of sugar, flour, and oil. Children gnawed acorns, boiled weeds, anything to stave off the sharp edge of hunger. But here, in the custody of their former enemies, these women found abundance. It was a contrast so sharp it bordered on absurdity, the kind of irony only history seems capable of writing. Records from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps reveal the numbers. An average prisoner received nearly 3,200 calories a day in American camps. Rice, canned meats, powdered milk, vegetables, and even occasional fruit. Back in Japan, civilians struggled to scrape together half of that. To the women stepping into those mess halls for the first time, the meals seemed like feasts. And yet, each bite carried not just nourishment, but confusion. Was this generosity? Was it calculation? Could kindness truly be offered without cost? Or was this some elaborate trick of psychological warfare? To understand their astonishment, one must recall the last months of the war in Japan. By early 1945, urban families were surviving on barely 1,300 calories a day. The government encouraged citizens to grind pine bark into flour to stretch what little rice remained with barley or sweet potatoes. Victory through sacrifice, the slogans had declared. But victory had crumbled into ash. And so the Japanese women who found themselves behind American barbed wire arrived with stomachs hollowed and spirits brittle. Every expectation told them the enemy would finish what the bombers had begun. Instead, they found themselves in clean barracks, handed blankets, and seated at long tables with trays of food that seemed impossibly generous. Mariko, an auxiliary nurse, later recalled the first time she bit into white bread. She had seen it once before on the table of a wealthy family in Kobe, but here it was offered to her, a prisoner. Its softness shocked her. She broke into tears, the taste of wheat carrying both comfort and humiliation. To her, the bread was not just food. It was proof that her nation had lost, that everything she had been told about the Americans was not entirely true. There were guards, of course. The barbed wire was real. Freedom was not on offer. But even so, the first shock came not from cruelty, but from care. The Americans had a motive that was partly pragmatic. Washington wanted to set an example to prove to the world and to future occupied Japan that the United States stood for order and humanity. General Douglas MacArthur himself, preparing for his role in post-war Reconstruction, emphasized humane treatment of prisoners. Every meal served was in its way a performance of American ideals. Yet to the women who had braced for blows and starvation, it felt less like performance and more like a miracle. The shift was not instant. Suspicion lingered. A bowl of hot miso soup could not erase years of fear or propaganda. Some women stared at their trays for long minutes, too weary to taste, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But hunger is a powerful persuader. Soon the sound of spoons against bowls filled the halls, punctuated by sighs of relief. Some even laughed, thin, nervous laughter that seemed almost forbidden. The idea that the enemy could feed them so well was both absurd and comforting. From the outside, the camps looked like what they were: prison enclosures, guarded, regimented, bound by military order. But from within, the first meals broke open an unexpected truth. Even war, at its bitterest end, had room for gestures of decency. Sachiko, a Red Cross worker, later wrote in her journal that the taste of American stew haunted her long after she returned to Japan, not because it was exquisite, but because it was given freely, without contempt. In the worst of times, she wrote, they gave us food as if we were human beings still. For the women, many in their 20s and 30s, this experience cut across layers of identity. They were Japanese. They were daughters of a defeated empire, and they were captive. But in that moment, they were also simply women who were hungry, who tasted nourishment, who felt the first fragile stirrings of safety. The meals did not erase the war. They did not erase Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the firebombings, or the grief. But they did remind the captives that survival was still possible, and that survival could begin in the most unlikely places. Yet beneath the relief, a quiet conflict brewed. Could they admit even to themselves that the enemy had shown mercy? Could they carry that truth back to a homeland where mothers still waited with empty bowls? And what would it mean for the image of Americans they had been taught to fear and hate? Each spoonful was both comfort and challenge, a small act of nourishment that threatened to rewrite years of belief. The women ate, they whispered, they exchanged glances that carried both gratitude and unease. Outside the barracks, the Pacific winds carried the smell of salt and smoke from battlefields not long silent. Inside, the scent of hot rice and broth hung in the air. And as Tomoko, a young woman, set her tray down, she realized with a shiver that her life had just entered a new chapter. Because what awaited them was not only food. The meals were merely the first revelation. Something deeper, something that would unsettle their loyalties, reshape their memories, and leave a mark long after the war was only just beginning to reveal itself. The days that followed their arrival in the American camps blurred into a rhythm that at first felt alien. Every morning the women awoke to the clang of bells and the distant hum of trucks beyond the wire. They expected harshness, but the rules were methodical, almost bureaucratic: work details, mealtimes, inspections. Yet what unsettled them most was not the fences or the guards, but the glimpses of American life just beyond. Breakfast was often the first surprise. Powdered eggs scrambled into a pale yellow mound, a slice of white bread softened with butter, and coffee so bitter that most Japanese women winced at their first sip. The Americans drank it black, gulping it down as if it were lifeblood. The prisoners whispered to each other, some laughing nervously, that it tasted like medicine. But it was filling, and in those mornings they learned that coffee's bitterness could be softened with canned milk and sugar, luxuries that wartime Japan had almost forgotten existed. Lunch and dinner brought even greater shock. Bowls of rice appeared with portions larger than what some had seen in months. Fish, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, was laid alongside vegetables stewed until tender. There was corned beef, pink, salty, and alien, which divided opinion. Some wrinkled their noses, declaring it inedible, while others ate greedily, convinced that even this foreign meat was better than the turnips and sweet potato leaves that had once sustained them. Emiko recalled later in a memoir written decades after the war that her first bite of canned pears nearly made her cry. She hadn't tasted fruit in 4 years. The syrup clung to her lips, so sweet it hurt. For a moment, she felt like a child again before the war had stripped sweetness from the world. The statistics tell the story in cold numbers. American camps issued approximately 3,200 to 3,400 calories per day to prisoners. Rice, bread, potatoes, beans, meat, and occasional fruit. By contrast, in 1945 Japan, civilian rations often dipped below 1,300 calories. Families stretched meager rice supplies with chestnuts or pine bark. Mothers boiled weeds to feed children. Hunger was not an inconvenience. It was a constant fear. The women in the camps carried those memories in their bones, and every generous portion felt almost indecent. When the gates finally opened and the women stepped back into a world no longer defined by fences and patrols, they carried more than their belongings. They carried stories, strange, unsettling, and difficult to explain to families who had endured the starvation of post-war Japan. Some carried extra weight on their frames, a visible reminder of the food that had sustained them in captivity. Others carried only the invisible burden of memory, the taste of bread and pears, the sound of a soldier's whistle, the way dignity had quietly returned to them in the least expected of places. Back in Japan, the contrast was stark. Cities still lay in ruins. Yokohama was a skeleton of streets lined with ash and rubble. Food shortages had only grown worse in the months after surrender, and many families survived on meager bowls of watery soup. For women who had eaten regularly in American camps, it was almost impossible to reconcile abundance with the hunger they saw in their own neighborhoods. Some admitted privately that the meals in captivity had been the most nourishing of their lives. To say so aloud, however, risked misunderstanding. How could one explain that the enemy had given them more to eat than their homeland had been able to provide? Historians later noted that these testimonies complicated the neat lines of victors and vanquished. U.S. military records confirm that the American government intended to treat prisoners humanely, both to honor international law and to project a moral image in the post-war world. Red Cross inspections praised the camps for their relative cleanliness and consistent food supplies. And yet for the women themselves, these policies were not abstractions. They were lived realities, full stomachs, softened suspicions, and moments of human recognition that broke through layers of indoctrination. Emiko years later told her granddaughter about the first time she tasted canned pears in camp. She laughed at the memory of her own shock when the sweetness lingered on her tongue. For me, it was broken food, she confessed. For her granddaughter, raised in a prosperous Japan that had long since embraced Western imports, the story was amusing. But for Emiko, it was more than humor. It was the memory of a moment when the world tilted, as if they were feasting while their own families starved across the sea. This sense of guilt weighed heavily, but hunger always won in the end. No one could resist the pull of food that filled the belly and dulled the ache of famine. Conversations at the long wooden tables often circled back to the absurdity of it all. "We are captives," Mariko whispered, "and yet we eat like queens." Another replied, "And what are our mothers eating now?" The question lingered heavy as the silence that followed, for no one dared to answer. Even humor found its place in the strangeness. Women teased each other about acquiring American stomachs, laughing at how quickly they had adapted to bread and butter. Some joked that they would return home plump and unrecognizable, their mothers scolding them for betraying Japanese modesty. Others teased about the coffee again, saying if this is how Americans wake up every day, no wonder they have so much energy. Laughter came easier when bellies were full. But beneath the joking, there was always unease.